Okay. So there are two methods. We talked about the handshake. There are two methods or two algorithms that we use. One is using RSA, which is a public key encryption methodology, and one is using Diffie-Hellman, which is a different. And Diffie-Hellman is actually the newer version and the more secure version. We'll talk about that as we look in the next slide. So the first thing the client does, remember if you go back to that slide that we had with the 10 steps, first thing the client does is it sends a hello, some random bits in the Cipher Suites that it supports. And the server is going to generate some number, random on his side. Remember, the client generated his. It's going to send that random information. It's going to send its public key certificate, right, that was issued by CA. Ignore the session ID for session resumption because a lot of browsers now don't support session resumption because there's actually vulnerabilities in using session resumption. So now the client has its own random, the server's public key certificate. The server has the client random, the server random, and its public key certificate, right? The client is then going to take some information here and it's going to encrypt the pre-master secret using the server's public key. So this is encrypted. No one can read it until it gets to here, to the server. The server is able to read that using its private key to essentially extrapolate the pre-master key, right? So this is the method where we can exchange that data from here to here without anybody else seeing, okay? Now, once it's done that, it's taking the information that it got to construct, using a common algorithm, a session key. And since the client has the same information, it's random, the server random, and the pre-master, it can construct the same key, right? And if they both constructed the same key correctly, now they can talk to one another, right? There's a fundamental flaw in this, which is over time, remember we talked about private key means that I'm the only one that's able to decrypt the data. If I'm sitting somewhere in the middle and I'm looking at all this traffic, and I don't know what that pre-master secret is or the session key, right? But I'm recording all the communication that's going on throughout the exchange. If at some point in time I'm able to compromise the private key because the private key methodology has become obsolete, somehow it got into my hands, etc., a vulnerability in a system that exposed that, I can now take that information that was exchanged in the clear, decrypt the information that was exchanged here, reconstruct the session key, and now I can decipher all the communication that happened, okay, after the fact. I may not be able to impact it during the exchange, but I can read the data after the fact later on. And that's a dangerous thing. So there's a more secure method called the Diffie-Hellman method, where you can see the first couple of steps are very similar, right? But what's happening here is a little bit different, okay? Is that instead of using the public key certificate to exchange that data, what's happening really is that the server, right, generates information. In essence, they're generating information in memory to exchange. So then the private key for the exchange of that, versus using their own standard key, standard private public key, they're using an ephemeral key. They're using a temporary key in memory to exchange the data, but in such a way that you can see here that the pre-master secret is actually never exchanged. It's rather derived from the exchange of data. Okay, there's a great slide here that this is how I explain this to people because it's a little bit harder to explain in the previous slide. But let's assume you're both starting with a common color, and now you each decide on your own secret color that you're going to use, and you mix those two colors to get some new color. Okay, now you're exchanging those colors that were made up of the combination with each other. And by applying your secret key and your secret color on each side, you both are going to end up with the same color. But that secret color was never sent. So Diffie-Hellman algorithm actually allows you to change and get to this, which is in essence our session key equivalent, without ever sending the pre-master key along. It's a beautiful algorithm, very complex to explain,
well,
but that's...
If the algorithm to create that mixed column is known,
you can send this in clear text, and the algorithm is complex enough because it's using large enough prime numbers and permutations that the likelihood of you cracking it with today's technology, it's not, right? It's just not going to happen. Right? At least, again, not that we're aware of. No one's been able to crack it, so who knows, right? Yeah, this is a lot easier to explain than trying to explain the previous slide, but the complexity there is that you can see that where in the past we sent the pre-master, you can see here, we sent the pre-master secret along, encrypted it, right, where it's exposed because it's over the wire, now when someone sees it. In here, the pre-master is actually derived from information that was sent around, right? So that way, the keys here are implicitly derived from this methodology without ever sending the secret sauce. Okay. The last thing, actually, no, it's not the last thing. They've got a couple of more slides here to talk about the internals. So we talked about the handshake protocol. That's the first thing. That's the key exchange. So now that you've got a key, the shared key, and that's a symmetric key, because remember we talked about the fact that symmetric key encryption, decryption is a lot faster than asymmetric. The asymmetric key encryption, decryption is heavier. Just the sheer algorithms that are used, right, in that technique. So once we've exchanged and now have the symmetric keys, the shared keys, and we're exchanging data that only we can read, the record protocol is what's used really. And that's all that is you've got some header information in your record. You've got encrypted data using the shared key, and you've got that digest, right? That's telling us, in essence, this is identifier that tells us that if I computed this data here, right, after I deciphered it or decoded it, if I computed a hash or some value of it, and it's equivalent to this, then I know that the message hasn't been tampered with, right? The Mac is using what's called a one-way hash. So unlike the encryption, decryption methodologies that we talked about, where either using the same key or different keys to encrypt and decrypt data, hashes are in essence a one-way algorithm that's mapping some data to a value that's most likely is unique. That if I took 1 billion different books and I try to compute the hash of them, each one of them would get a different hash value. So there's no collision there, right? And that's what's important here, is because you're using a value in a standard algorithm to take this data after it's decrypted and hash the value to make sure that it's not tampered with, right? And the chances of someone being able to modify the hash value are very, essentially non-existent. Okay, the last part, kind of internal. So when we talk about communication, we talked about a number of things that have to do with SSL communication. And so you're going to hear this term Cipher Suites when you're using SSL. And I talked about it before. When the client sends and the server sends in response, here are the set of Cipher Suites that I support. Cipher Suites are these strings here, which is what we normally see, but they are made up of a bunch of elements that determine along the phases of SSL what's going to happen, right? So TLS protocol, which is what we use today, we don't want to be using any Cipher Suites that have SSL at the beginning, because they're not going to be very secure. This here is going to identify your key exchange. This is how we're coming up with the symmetric key exchange, right? So DHC, Diffie-Hellman, this basically means that we're using the ephemeral Diffie-Hellman methodology, right, which is the more secure method versus RSA. The signature of the exchange. Data encryption here, this is what we're using for the record protocol, right? The symmetric key encryption methodology and encryption methodology we're going to use. This is AES 256.
Data encryption. That's data encryption.
That's the data encryption, right? So we're taking the symmetric key and... Sorry, date, not data. Data, yes, I apologize. Good catch. And then the last part is our MAC, right? This is our message authentication piece, right? That's at the end of it. SHA is, if you're familiar, we used to have MD5 as a hashing element. MD5 is very insecure. SHA, we've had SHA-1, SHA-2, etc. This is 384-bit SHA, which is fairly, it's pretty good. Right. Okay. All right, so that takes us to the next section, which is talking about some interesting attacks on SSL. Before we go into talking, I've got four types or four examples of SSL attacks. I want to talk about the history of SSL because what happened is really as we've seen these attacks, SSL has evolved over time to try to improve the security, the overall security, and prevent some of these attacks from continuing on. So we first started in 94, 95 when Netscape defined version 1.0 of SSL, and they didn't really release it into their Netscape browser, for those of us that were around using Netscape browsers back in the day, until 95, and that went into their browser, and that was a standard. And then a year later, they went into SSL v3, and it was a redesign of a lot of security elements because they found a lot of weaknesses in the way SSL v2 worked. So SSL v3 came out about a year later. You can see very quickly within the span of 2 years, we went from introduction to a somewhat secure method that existed for a while. And then 3 years later, and the reason why this took a while is because now we went into an RFC, and when you go through an RFC process, a lot of people have to review it, they have to agree, yada yada, so it takes a while. So it took 3 years for TLS 1.0, which was a complete redesign of SSL. Had a lot of things in common, and in fact, TLS 1.0 allowed for the fallback into SSL in many respects. This first came out. And then 5 years later, we had 1.1, which solved a bunch of things, and you will see that there are a number of, as we talk about some of the attacks, you'll see there were some things that occurred between here and here that led to 1.1 coming out. And then a couple years later, very quickly, they went with 1.2, which is now the de facto standard and has been for quite some time. Just August of 2018, they released the RFC for 1.3, and that's still being rolled out, right? Which is important. But as we've gone through the years and we found issues, designs, whether it's improved algorithms, some new elements of key exchange, elements of the data protocol exchange, all have been modified in order to make I call it SSL just because that's how it started. If you hear SSL or TLS, it's unless they're providing you a version, people are talking about the same concept. So when we talk about SSL, we're actually talking about TLS. When we talk about the latest SSL, we're actually talking about TLS 1.3, right? It's just, you know, for the layperson, there's really no difference between SSL and TLS from just a conversation context point of view, right? Unless you're saying SSL 1 versus TLS 1.3, right? Then you know that there's a difference there. Okay, we're going to talk about 4 interesting attacks on SSL. And again, I use SSL, but some of them actually apply to TLS as well. And there's an RFC that's out there, 7457, that is actually talks about the different SSL attacks. It lists them and goes into some details on each one of them. The 4 that I chose to talk about are SSL stripping, poodle crime, and heartbleed. It's interesting that the first 3 are man-in-the-middle attacks, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. Heartbleed really wasn't a man-in-the-middle attack This was just taking advantage of a vulnerability in OpenSSL, which is a common, probably the most commonly used library for SSL. When it comes to encryption, and Saqib's going to attest to this, when it comes to encryption, the last thing you want to do is write your own encryption algorithms, encryption libraries. Even if you have a book that talks about the algorithm itself in detail, ad nauseum, the last thing you want to do is actually develop your own library to implement those algorithms. Because security algorithms are very finicky and very difficult to get right. And so OpenSSL is a library that's been around for quite some time. It's the de facto standard library to be used. And Heartbleed actually took advantage of that, doing something that some of you may know as a buffer overflow. It was actually it was an interesting one. We'll talk about that in a minute.
What would be the incentive to do it on your own?
Not created here syndrome, right? I can do it better. I can do it simpler. I could do it cheaper. You know, you name it, people have tried it, right? But if you spend even 5 seconds in the mathematics of encryption, you're going to essentially know that you're out of your realm and should use a standard library. That's the simple. I'm sure you've seen a bunch of people that have tried to invent their own type of stuff, and it's.
But how can you trust a standard library?
This is open source library. It's a standard library, so it's been validated and reviewed and used for years and years and years.
It's open source. A lot of people are looking at the code. They're quick to point out the vulnerabilities. If you're doing your own thing,
right,
then there until somebody finds out.
The pros and cons of using open source, right? One is that you get a lot of eyeballs on it, so people are contributing and improving, etc. You might look at it from a con side to say, well, people can read through the code and find vulnerabilities by doing white box, right, code reviews. The benefit is that you've got enough eyeballs on that to where if someone finds a vulnerability, someone else may have seen it already, and so they're working on it, right? So there's a lot of benefits to open source.
Demonstrated that it's the best way to get actually something solid.
Yep. Okay. So let's talk about the first one, which is SSL stripping. Back in 2009, there was a presentation that was given that talked about SSL stripping. And essentially, this is an interesting man-in-the-middle attack that doesn't necessarily take advantage of SSL vulnerabilities per se, but is related to SSL. So what's a man-in-the-middle attack? A man-in-the-middle attack, in essence, is that as I am a client trying to talk to some website, if I'm an attacker, I'm going to inject myself into the middle of the conversation. And rather than allow the victim to go through unaltered in communication with the server, I'm going to inject myself in the point to where they're communicating through me, right? Now, I've been playing around, and I wasn't able to get it to the point where I was ready to demonstrate it tonight. But there are vulnerabilities in the underlying networking protocols used to establish communication, whether it's joining a Wi-Fi network, right? Getting your IP address, or even knowing who you're talking to when you're talking to a router, right? The underlying protocols. I, as a hacker, as an attacker, could put a USB Wi-Fi stick and create my own hotspot and advertise it to everybody, and you join it. And when you join it, I'm going to give you an IP address because I'm going to act as what's called a DHCP, a dynamic IP address server. And I'm going to set myself maybe as a DNS, a domain name server, and I'm going to also act as your router. Okay? Now, once I've done that, I've pretty much got you owned. Any website that you're going to try to go to, I, as a DNS server, could tell you to go to a different website, and you wouldn't know, right, unless you've got the SSL certificate to prove it. But I can then redirect you to any website I want. Okay? I, as your router, can capture all traffic that's going between you and the internet or the server by standing in the middle and capturing that data, and in fact, altering that data if I wanted to. What SSL stripping did was pretty simple at its core. Again, it's not attacking any vulnerabilities in SSL. It's